Hi guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. So today we are going to be learning how to draft a simple basic bodice pattern, and if that's something you're interested in, please keep on watching. So for this tutorial, I'm making use of my ruler, my French curve, my marker and my tape. So let's get right into the video. So guys, the first thing I want to do now is to mark my bust points, and to do that I'm going to place my tape on the beginning part of my paper, which is also serving as a starting point. And so the bust point I'm working with is 10 inches. As you can see on the screen, bust point is from your shoulder to your nipple. So after marking 10 inches, which is my bust point, I will come down to my half length, and so the half length I am working with is 16 inches as well, as you can see on the screen too. So from that point where I marked my half length, I will place my tape there, and then I would come down by 8 inches, and that point is serving as my hip line, because from the waist or from the half length to 8 inches is the hip line. So after marking it now, I'm just going to mark a straight line across on the points where I marked. Okay guys, so now that I'm done marking out these lines, I want to label them. And so on this first point, or this first line, I'm going to be labeling it my bust point, and then coming down to the second one, I'll label it half length, and then on the third line I would label it hip line, so that you don't get confused. And so the next thing I want to do now is to mark out my shoulder. So the shoulder measurement I'm working with is 16 inches. As you can see on the screen, the shoulder is from one point of the shoulder to the other end of the shoulder. So I'm dividing my shoulder measurement by 2, and then I'll add half of an inch allowance. So my shoulder measurement divided by 2 gives me 8, and then plus half of an inch allowance for sewing. So that gives me 8.5 inches. So I'm just going to mark 8.5 inches on this point. So after marking it now, I'll leave that aside and then come back to this point right here, because I want to mark out the neckline. So I'll place my tape on that point right there, as you can see, and then I'll mark 3 inches like this, and then from that same point, or the starting point, I would come down by 3 inches as well. You can come down by 4 inches depending on how deep you want your neckline to be. So basically I'm just going to be connecting these two together. You can either make use of a free hand or you can make use of a French curve, but I decided to make use of my French curve so that the line is going to be neat. Now the next thing I want to do is to mark out my shoulder slope, and the essence of marking a shoulder slope is because the shoulder is not entirely straight. So on that point where we marked our shoulder line, I will come down by 1 inch, and so from that point I'm just going to be connecting to this point of our neckline. So basically that is it. I hope you understand, guys. Okay guys, moving on, the next thing I want to know is to mark out my armhole line, and so I'll place my tape on my bust point, and then I'll come up by 1.5 of an inch. So I'll just make use of my ruler to mark a straight line across, and I will label it my armhole line. Alright, now so the next thing I want to do is to mark out my dart, and so that measurement is usually from one nipple to another nipple, and so the nipple to nipple that I'm working with is 8 inches. So I'm going to be dividing 8 inches by 2, and I have 4 inches. So I'll place my tape on that point right there, and I would mark 4 inches, just as you see me doing like this. So I'm marking 4 inches on the half length. I also mark it on the hip line as well as the bust point. So guys, just make sure you do like this on your own pattern paper, and after doing that I'll make use of my ruler to connect the 3 dots together. Alright guys, moving on, the next step is to come up by 2 inches on the hip line. So as you can see, I placed my tape on the point where we have our hip line, and then I'm coming up by 2 inches, and then I went ahead to give it a mark on this point right here. And so on the bust point as well, I'm going to come down by 1 inch, and I'll give it a mark as well. The essence of doing this is because of the boobs we have in front. And so on this half length point, I'm going to also be coming in by half of an inch on the left and half of an inch on the right as well. So just pay attention to see how I'm doing it. And after giving these marks, the next thing I'm going to do is to just connect the 3 points together. So basically I'm connecting this point right here to this, and then this to this, and also this. So just watch how I'm going to connect the 3 lines together. Alright guys, so after marking my dart, this is what it looks like. And so the next thing I want to do now is to mark out our measurements on this bodice pattern. And so now to start with, we're going to be making use of our bust measurement. So the bust measurement I'm working with divided by 4 gives me 9 inches. So I'm just marking 9 inches on this point right here. So coming down to the half length, which is this line right here, I'm going to be using my waist circumference. And so the waist circumference divided by 4 gives me 7 inches. So I'll mark 7 inches on this point. And because on this point here we have our dart, and since we're going to be sewing the dart in, we'll replace it back on this measurement. So the dart measurement we have for this dart is 1 inch. So I'm just going to mark 1 inch on this side right here. And so coming down to the hip line, I'm going to be dividing the hip measurement I'm working with divided by 4. So the hip circumference divided by 4 is 9.5 inch. So I'm just going to mark 9.5 inch on this point. So guys, on this armhole now, I'm going to be marking 9 inches, and 9 inches is the same measurement I have on my bust point. So whatever measurement you have on your bust point, you're going to be marking it on your armhole. So after doing that, I'm just going to be connecting all the points that I marked together. All right, now so the next thing I want to now is to mark out my seam allowance. So if you're going to be working with 2 inches seam allowance, you're going to go ahead and place your tape on this point and mark it. But I'm working with 1.5 inch seam allowance, so I'm just going to be adding it 1.5 inch on this point, and then after marking out 1.5 inch, I'll use my ruler to connect it together just like I did earlier. All right guys, so now I want to work on my armhole, and so what I'm just going to do is to make use of my ruler. And so from that point where we marked our shoulder, I'm just going to make use of my marker to mark a straight line down to my armhole line. And so the next thing I want to do now is to determine the center point of this line which I marked. So as you can see, I have almost 8 inches. So I'm just going to be folding my tape into two so that I'm going to be getting the center point of what I have. And you can see it's about 4 inches. So I'm just marking 4 inches on this point, and this point is the center of this line. So what I'm just going to do now is to place my tape on that point where I have 4 inches, and then I'm going to be going in by 1/2 inch. So as you can see, I already marked 1/2 inch. So basically, I'm just going to be connecting it from here to this point, and then from this point to this other end of our sewing allowance. I hope you understand what I just explained, guys. Okay, so the essence of coming in by 1/2 inch on this front basic bodice armhole area is because the front armhole is usually deeper than the back. So now after connecting all the points together, this is what the armhole looks like. So now I'm just going to be cancelling this actual line that we had. So we're not going to be working with this line anymore. And so guys, this is what the front basic bodice looks like. So now that I'm done drafting it out, I'm just going to cut it out with my scissors. Okay guys, so now that I'm done cutting it out, this is what the front basic bodice looks like. So now it's time to work on the back piece. And so I have my pattern paper here as well. So the first thing I'm going to be doing is to place my tape on this point right here, and then I'm going to be marking 1.5 inch all the way down to this end. I'll also mark it at the top, and this 1.5 inch is going to be serving as my zipper allowance. So after making points like this, I'll make use of my ruler to connect all these points together. So guys, just like the way we did in the front, so we're just going to place our tape on the starting point of our pattern paper, and then I'm going to mark in 10 inches, which is serving as my bust point, 16 inches as my half length, and from that 16 inches I'll place my tape there, and then I'll mark 8 inches, and that point is going to be serving as my hip line. So I'll just place my ruler on this point and mark a straight line across, and so I'll do it on all the points which I marked. Now I want to mark out my shoulder, and so to do that, I'll place my tape on the point where I marked out for my zipper allowance, and then I'll mark 8.5 inch just like we did in the front. So now I want to mark my neckline as well. So placing my tape on the line where I marked out for my zipper allowance as well, I'm going to be marking 3 inches just like I did now, and I'll come down by 1 inch. So after marking 1 inch on this point, I'm just going to be connecting both points together, and so this is going to be serving as the back neckline, because the back neckline shouldn't be as deep as the front, and so I'm going to be extending it towards this zipper allowance area. So after doing that, now the next thing I want to do is to mark my shoulder slope, and just like I did in the front, I'm going to be coming down by 1 inch. So after marking 1 inch here, I'll connect it to this point right here with my ruler. Alright, so moving on, next thing I want to do is to mark out my dart. And so to do that, I'll place my tape on the point where I marked for my zipper allowance, and then I'll mark 4 inches on the half length. And so I'll also come down to the hip line and also mark 4 inches as well. And then I'll come up to the bust point line and I'll mark 4 inches as well. So after marking these 3 points, I'm just going to be making use of my ruler to connect the 3 points together, just like this. So guys, now from this hip line, we're going to place our tape on that point, and then we'll come up by 1.5 of an inch. But when we're drafting the front pattern, we came up by 2 inches. So now on this bust point line, we're not going to be coming down by 1 inch, because that was exactly what we did in the front. And so guys, now that I'm done with that, now on this half length area, I would come in by 1/2 of an inch on the left and 1/2 of an inch on the right as well. So after making this point, I'm just going to be connecting the 3 points together, just like the way we did in the front. So guys, now I want to mark out my body measurements, and so I'm going to be starting with the bust point line. And so I'll place my tape on the points where I marked out for my zipper allowance line, and then I'll mark 9 inches, which is my bust measurement divided by 4. So coming down to my half length, now my waist measurement divided by 4 gives me 7 inches. So I'm going to be placing this dart, and the dart is about 1 inch measurement. And so coming down to the hip area, the hip line, my hip measurement divided by 4 gives me 9.5 of an inch. So I'm just going to be connecting the 3 points together with my ruler. And so after marking the 3 points together, I'll go ahead and add 1.5 of an inch on all the sides, and that's going to be serving as my seam allowance. So guys, now I want to mark out my armhole line, and so from my bust points, I'm coming up by 1.5 of an inch. So after doing that, now I'll make use of my ruler to draw a straight line across, and so this line now is going to be serving as my armhole line. This is exactly the same thing we did in the front. And so now that I'm done with that, I'm just going to be extending the lines that I have on my bust points. I'll extend it on my armhole line, just as you see me doing now. I want to mark out the armhole curve for my back, and I won't be doing the same thing I did for the front. I'm just going to make use of my French curve to connect these 2 points together. So as you can see, I'm making use of my French curve to connect them together, and I'm making sure that they are sitting properly on the 2 points. And after connecting them together, this is what it looks like. So now that I'm done connecting them together, or rather marking it out, I'll just make use of my scissors to cut it out. Okay guys, so now that I'm done drafting it out, this is what they look like. And so now I've come to the end of this tutorial video. Thank you so much guys for watching up to this point, and if you've not subscribed to my channel, please don't forget to subscribe for more sewing content, and I'll see you all in my next video. Bye. Up kicking myself, exhale 'cause I heard it helps, but